Story 1. After a year-long battle, my situation finally came to a close, though the resolution wasn't exactly my revenge, but revenge on my behalf. To provide a bit of backstory, my wife and I bought a house about 5 years ago. Unfortunately, it flooded 3 times within 3 years, despite not having flooded in the previous 40 years. Thanks, climate change. After the 3rd flood, we were finally financially able to move out and sell the house, though at a loss. We searched and found what we thought was our dream home. However, about 6 months after moving in, we noticed something odd. Whenever it rained heavily, our bathtub would backfill with sewage, and the toilets wouldn't flush. We called a plumber, and they informed us that our sewer lines were broken between the house and the city's sewer line. Although they could attempt spot repairs, they suggested we would likely need to replace the entire line. Given that we had just spent a lot of money on our new home and taken a loss on our old one, we asked them to keep the costs as low as possible. The plumbers began digging where the line was damaged. Damaged was an understatement. The line had practically disintegrated. We needed to replace the whole thing, which would cost about $5,000. Not ideal, but we moved forward. Once the plumbers exposed the line, they hit a major roadblock. The line was so deteriorated that they couldn't locate where our residential line connected to the city's sewer line, also known as the tap. According to regulations, homeowners are responsible for the residential line, while the city is responsible for the tap and the main sewer line. I asked the plumbers what was needed next. They said we needed to get the city's plans and dig to uncover the tap. This meant more digging and more money. At this point, it had been 2 weeks, and all we wanted was to use our own bathroom again. We gave the go-ahead for the extra digging. The plumbers dug a large hole about 4 feet by 4 feet and 10 feet deep, but found nothing. We double-checked the city's plans, and we had dug exactly where the plans indicated the tap should be. We then had to deal with the city. After being on hold with the city's 311 service for 3 hours, we received the same plans we already had. We informed them that we had already dug in that location, and there was no tap. Getting nowhere over the phone, my wife decided to go down to City Hall. After spending her entire vacation day waiting, she finally met with an official we'll call Richard. He printed out the same plans we had and insisted that the tap was where it was marked. My wife showed him a picture of the hole we had already dug. Richard, seemingly annoyed, grabbed a pen and marked a new location on the map, showing the residential line taking a slight detour about 10 feet west of the original spot. It was clear he just wanted her out of his office. The plumbers came back and dug a second hole again, 4 feet by 4 feet and 10 feet deep. And, once again, no tap. Our backyard was now destroyed, piles of dirt everywhere, our lawn and trees were dead, and our beautiful yard was a mess. At this point, we were beyond frustrated. My wife took another vacation day to go back to Richard's office. We calmly insisted that someone from the city needed to come out and physically locate the tap. They finally agreed, and I took a day off to wait for the crew. To their credit, they actually got into the sewer, did some real digging, and marked a new location this time, between the 2 holes we had already dug. We were hopeful this would be it. The plumbers dug a 3rd hole. If you're thinking they found the tap, you'd be mistaken. By now, our backyard was completely ruined, and we were at our wits' end. We went back to Richard, wasting yet another vacation day. We explained that it seemed our house had never been properly connected to the city's main sewer line. Richard didn't take responsibility, but he sent out the contractor who had done the original work on the taps in our area. When the contractor arrived, we finally got the full story. 2 years earlier, while the previous owner was making home improvements and wasn't living in the house, the city replaced the main sewer line. The contractor couldn't access the backyard, so they informed the city that they didn't service our house, and that was that. I was furious. We had spent over $20,000, lost months of our time, and wasted vacation days, all because Richard couldn't be bothered to do his job and make one phone call to the contractor. But I had learned from the flooding issues at our first house, so we recorded everything, every phone call, every email, and even the contractor's explanation, all legally in our state. Both parties must consent to being recorded. The contractor installed the tap, and I finally took my first shower in 3 months. Feeling ready to take action, I went back to Richard's office, armed with all the evidence. I explained that I was willing to cover the cost of the residential line, as that was my responsibility, but I wanted the city to reimburse me for the unnecessary holes we had dug. I thought I had a solid case. Unfortunately, Richard informed me that the city required homeowners to file a claim before starting any work and provide 3 estimates in writing. Since none of that had been done, my claim was denied on the spot. Completely defeated, I walked away. On the way home, my wife reminded me that we had lawyer friends, so I reached out. That's when I learned about sovereign immunity, a legal principle that makes it nearly impossible to sue the city or state. No credible lawyer would take my case because it would just be a waste of money. I was stuck. Almost a year passed, and the loans we took out to cover the expenses were about to come due. I had no idea how we were going to pay them. I tried every avenue to contact Richard and his office, even reaching out to his boss, but I was blocked at every turn. Finally, I sent a last-ditch email to my council member, attaching a summary of our situation and all the evidence I had collected. I didn't expect much. To my surprise, an hour after sending the email, my phone rang. It was my council member, and she was furious about how we had been treated. She told me she had a meeting scheduled with the head of Public Works later that week and promised to fight for us. After the meeting, she called me to say that the head of Public Works had accepted full responsibility and wanted receipts for everything: the plumber, our lost vacation days, phone records from all the time we spent on hold, the landscaping quote to fix the backyard, everything. By the time she returned to her office, I had sent her everything she needed. About 3 weeks later, I met with my council member in her office. "Thank you so much," I said. "My wife and I can't repay you for all you've done." "It was my pleasure," she replied. We chatted for a bit, and then she handed me a check. "This is amazing. We can pay off the loan and finally fix our yard." "Wait, this is much more than we need," I said, surprised. She smiled and said, "You forgot to include emotional distress. I added it in for you." She winked and added, "Oh, and if you ever have any more issues, don't worry about dealing with Richard. He no longer works there. Just come to me. I've become good friends with the head of Public Works." I was stunned. "Oh my goodness, you're the best person I know. If there's anything I can do." She grinned. "Well, elections are in the fall. Maybe you could turn out and vote." So I went home, paid off everything, and the landscapers are coming out next week. Oh, and I'm volunteering on her re-election campaign. Thanks for reading. Story 2. In 7th grade, I had an encounter with a cheater in my pre-algebra class. In this class, we were allowed to work in groups of up to 4 people on the math homework. I was one of the top students, along with 2 others, and we always worked quickly, finishing our homework before everyone else. Once done, we had free time, which we often used to play card games for about 5–10 minutes. Everything was going fine until halfway through the year, when one of the class clowns with poor grades casually sat down at our table. We didn't expect much from him, but he asked for help, and being kind, we assisted him. Over the next few months, we noticed his grades improving. On test days, instead of our usual group setup, the desks were arranged individually and facing the same way. There were no assigned seats, so the cheater conveniently placed himself between me and my friends. I didn't think much of it since he had been working with us for a while. However, it turned out to be a big deal. After finishing my exam, I went to turn it in, and when I returned to my seat, I noticed the cheater glancing at my friend's paper, copying answers. I felt betrayed but decided not to confront him immediately. Later that week, when the test scores were returned, the cheater had done remarkably well and even received a prize for most improved. I knew the real reason behind his success, and I felt used. That's when I began to plot my revenge. I told my 2 friends about what had happened, and they were just as eager to join in. We continued letting the cheater work on homework with us, but instead of helping him learn, we let him copy our answers. This gave us back the free time we had lost from helping him earlier, allowing us to relax and play cards again. However, this also ensured that he wasn't actually learning anything. Everything came to a head on the day of the final exam. I arrived early to class that day to ensure there was an open seat to my right, while my friends sat to my left. When the cheater arrived, he immediately took the seat next to me, looking relieved. I was just as relieved because my plan required him to cheat off me. Since it was the end-of-year exam, it was comprehensive and twice the size of a regular test. As I worked through the exam, I quickly noticed that the cheater was copying my answers. To test this, I skipped a question and flipped the page. Within seconds, he skipped the same question and moved to the next page as well. This was my cue for revenge. I began recording the correct answers on my worksheet, out of the cheater's view, while deliberately filling in the wrong answers on the exam sheet. He copied all of my incorrect answers. To make things less obvious, I skipped a few questions here and there, so our exams wouldn't be identical, and I took my time to ensure I didn't finish at the same time as him. Confident that he had done well, the cheater filled in the skipped questions with random guesses, turned in his test, and left the room with a smug expression. I was thrilled. After he left, I erased all of my incorrect answers and replaced them with the correct ones. This took some time, making me the last person to turn in my exam, which was perfect. When I handed in my exam, the teacher asked why it had taken me so long, as I was usually one of the first to finish. I explained the situation, telling him that I expected the cheater to get no more than 10 questions correct, especially not any after question 11. The teacher was disturbed by this revelation and asked me to follow him to the teacher's lounge, where the automatic grading machine was. He brought the answer key, my exam, and the cheater's exam. He ran my test through first, and I scored a 97. Then, he ran the cheater's test, and to his shock, the cheater scored a 7. The teacher thanked me for telling him and congratulated me on my score. He mentioned that he would speak with the principal and that I should expect to be called in later to explain the situation again. The fallout was swift. The principal decided that the cheater had to retake all of his end-of-year exams. It turned out that the cheater had been using similar tactics in other classes and failed multiple exams. As a result, he didn't pass 7th grade and had to attend summer school. The following year, I asked the math teacher how the cheater was doing, and he vaguely mentioned that we wouldn't be seeing him at school anymore. One of my friends later pointed out that the cheater's home was up for sale, and I never saw or heard about him again. Story 3. It all started back in 2001. I remember that day clearly because it was the eve of the Lunar New Year. We were celebrating, playing cards, and making dumplings at my neighbor's house. It was supposed to be a joyful night. But then, something strange happened. Water started flooding the house, and at first, we were all confused. We looked outside and realized the water wasn't just any water. It was toxic wastewater, and it was coming from the K-Korner factory nearby. That factory had been releasing chemical waste for a while. But this time, it was so bad that the wastewater flowed right into our homes and onto our farmland. Our crops were ruined. You see, we're farmers in Yushatan village, and our lives depend on the land. But that night, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I went to check my own farm. It was covered in sludge, and the stench was unbearable. The crops were gone, and I knew they wouldn't grow back. I wasn't the only one affected. Many of my neighbors' lands were also flooded, and soon enough, the government confirmed that the land wouldn't be usable for a long time due to the pollution. I wasn't about to let this go. So, I wrote a letter to the Land Resources Bureau of K-Korner, telling them about the mess K-Korner had made. But when I met with the officials, they asked me to prove it. Prove that the land was polluted, as if it wasn't obvious enough. But the more I pushed, the more I realized they weren't going to help us unless we had solid evidence and legal backing. That's when I decided I had to take matters into my own hands. I didn't know much about the law at the time, but I knew one thing. If we were going to fight K-Korner, I needed to learn. So, I started studying the law on my own. I had only finished up to 3rd grade, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I went to the local bookstore every day, reading through law books with a dictionary in hand. I couldn't afford to buy the books, so I copied down the parts I needed. In exchange for letting me stay in the shop, I'd bring the shopkeeper bags of corn from my farm, what little I could still grow. Anyway, for years, I studied. I gathered evidence, not just for myself, but for my neighbors as well. I couldn't let Kihua keep poisoning our land while we sat there, helpless. By 2007, a law firm that specialized in pollution cases heard about our struggle and started giving us free legal advice. They helped us file a petition against Kihua, but it took until 2015, 8 years later, for the court to actually start processing our case. It was a long wait, but we didn't give up. With all the evidence I had collected over those 16 years, we went to court. The case was heard in the Ngangsi District Court of Kikihar, and to everyone's surprise, we won the first instance. The court ruled that Kihua had to compensate the families in our village with 820,000 yuan. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. Of course, Kihua wasn't happy. They immediately appealed the decision. But I'm not worried. I've spent over a decade preparing for this, and I'm not backing down now. I told the reporter who came to my house, "We will certainly win. Even if we lose, we'll keep fighting." I'm in my 60s now, and I never thought I'd end up here, fighting a giant chemical company. But I knew it had to be done. It wasn't just about me and my farm. It was about my entire village, the people I grew up with, the land we all depend on. Kihua may have big money, but I've got something they don't: a will to see justice done, no matter how long it takes. Story 4. A Chinese farmer spent 16 years teaching himself law so he could sue a chemical company for allegedly polluting his land. Wang Lin, who only had 3 years of formal education, recently won the first stage of a high-profile lawsuit against the state-owned Kihua Group. Despite Kihua Group, which holds assets exceeding 2 billion yuan, about £233 million, appealing the decision, Wang remains determined to seek justice for himself and his neighbors. These villagers have been unable to grow healthy crops on their now contaminated land. Wang, who is in his 60s, lives in Yushutan village, located on the outskirts of Kikihar in Heilongjiang province. He says he will never forget the year 2001 when his land was flooded with toxic waste from the Kihua Group factory. It was the eve of the Lunar New Year, and Wang was playing cards and making dumplings with his neighbors when suddenly they realized wastewater had flooded the house. The same wastewater also swamped parts of the farmland in the village. According to reports, a government document from 2001 claimed the affected farmland could not be used for a long time due to pollution. From 2001 to 2016, it was reported that Kihua continued to dump hazardous waste into the village, where residents rely heavily on farming to make a living. The company produced polyvinyl chloride and released between 15,000 and 20,000 tons of chemical waste annually. They also created a 71-acre wasteland filled with calcium carbide residue and a 478-acre pond with their liquid waste. In 2001, Wang wrote a letter to the Land Resources Bureau of Kikihar to complain about the pollution Kihua had caused in the village. But when dealing with local officials, he was repeatedly asked to provide evidence that the village's land had been polluted. Wang: "I knew I was in the right, but I didn't know what laws the company had broken, or if there was enough evidence to prove it." Living in his small home, which he rented for just 50 yuan £5.80 a month from the village authority, Wang realized he needed to educate himself. With no formal training, he made the bold decision to study law on his own. For the next 16 years, this became his mission. Wang, who had dropped out of school after the 3rd grade, began reading through law books with the help of a dictionary. He couldn't afford to buy the books, so he spent days at a local bookstore, reading and copying down important information by hand. In return for the shopkeeper's kindness, Wang would offer bags of free corn from his farm. He didn't just study for himself. Wang also helped his neighbors gather evidence. Their farms, too, had been poisoned by Kihua's waste. In 2007, a law firm specializing in pollution cases began offering free legal advice to Wang and his neighbors. The firm agreed to help the villagers file a petition to take Kihua to court. However, due to several complications, it wasn't until 2015, 8 years after the petition was filed, that the court began processing their case. Thanks to the mountain of evidence Wang had gathered over 16 years, he and his neighbors won the first instance. The Angangsi District Court of Kikihar ruled that the families in Yushitan village should receive financial compensation from Kihua Group, amounting to 820,000 yuan, about 96,000 pounds. Kihua Group, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat. The company immediately appealed the decision, but Wang remains undeterred. "Wang, we will certainly win. Even if we lose, we will continue to fight." The case is still ongoing, but Wang's unwavering determination has brought hope to his village, which has been suffering from the effects of pollution for nearly 2 decades. The outcome of this case could set a precedent, not just for Wang and his neighbors, but for other communities fighting against corporate pollution across the country. Story 5. I got my first career job in local government, keeping track of its real estate and the legal documents related to it. It was my first 40-hour-per-week career job, and I was pretty green. At the time, multitasking was the big buzzword in business. Every job I applied for seemed to require someone with excellent multitasking skills. I thought it was a bit exaggerated. Personally, I worked best when I focused on one task at a time, managing my workload by scheduling my day in time blocks. I would plan my tasks in 15-minute increments when I arrived in the morning, ensuring I never missed a deadline or let a project fall through the cracks. Some tasks took a few hours, some a whole day, and others just 15 minutes. I liked keeping my desk neat. Everything that came into my physical inbox was sorted and prioritized, with paperwork filed and tasks scheduled based on urgency. This system kept my desk clear, save for one folder and a few maps related to the current task. When I finished one job, I would file away the completed work and pull out the next folder. One afternoon, my direct boss came into my office, looked at my desk with its single folder and 2 maps, glanced at my clean-topped filing cabinets, and eyed my empty physical inbox. He grunted and walked out. About 20 minutes later, he returned, dropped an 18-inch stack of folders and papers onto my inbox, and said proudly, "It doesn't look like you have enough to do. This should keep you busy." With a smile, he strutted back to his cluttered office. The pile he gave me was mostly busy work, 3 weeks of mind-numbing paperwork. It wasn't outside my job description, but it consisted of things like duplicate files, old contracts, unorganized documents, and outdated maps. After dealing with that avalanche of busy work, I learned my lesson. While doing my actual job was important, it was equally important to appear busy, so I could keep doing my real work without getting more unnecessary tasks. So I started saving old files, outdated maps, and documents that would normally have been recycled. I organized them into legitimate-looking folders and transformed my office into a cluttered mess that mirrored my boss's chaotic workspace. My inbox always had papers and folders in it, never empty. The pile's height and number varied daily. I stacked folders on top of the filing cabinets, on the floor, and even packed 24 white office boxes full of files around my work area. I even had a map rack filled with rolled-up, old maps. My office looked utterly chaotic. I even started walking everywhere with a steno pad, a file folder, and sometimes a map under my arm, no matter where I was going. Grabbing coffee, pad and file. Bathroom break, pad and file. Pointless meeting, pad and 2 files. Necessary, productive meeting, pad, relevant file, and relevant map. Every morning, after scheduling my real work, I would shuffle the fake folders and papers around my desk and workspace, moving the boxes every couple of weeks. Despite the apparent chaos, I kept one small area of my desk clean where the real work happened. One day, my boss peeked into my office. The door bumped into a stack of 3 full white boxes, preventing it from fully opening. A single file fell off the top and spilled its contents across the floor. He glanced at the mess he had just made, looked around at the piles of papers and folders, and said, sorry about that. What are you working on? I quickly rattled off 3 of the highest priority properties from that week's schedule and the tasks for each. All right, I'll give this to someone else, he said, walking down the hall. Little did he know, I had already completed those tasks. Story 6. A few years ago, my daughter and I went to a father-daughter activity at her school. My daughter, who was 6 at the time, had just lost her 2 front baby teeth, and her new permanent teeth were just starting to break through. It's important to remember this little detail because it'll come up later. So, we're at this event, and there's another dad there who I've had the misfortune of dealing with a few times. Let's just call him Jerky Dad, or JD for short. JD loves to show off. He's one of those know-it-all types who always has to let everyone know how great he is at everything. That day, he was there with his 2 daughters, one of whom was the same age as my daughter, and the other was around 10 years old. The event was going well until JD decided it was the perfect opportunity to teach his older daughter how to throw a frisbee. Now, this wasn't just any regular frisbee. JD had brought one of those heavy, competition-style frisbees. He made sure to tell everyone within earshot that he was part of an ultimate frisbee team and that his skills were top tier. Honestly, no one cared, but JD was in his own little world, convinced we were all there to witness his greatness. And where did JD decide to throw this massive frisbee? Right in the middle of the crowd, with about 80 people milling around. Genius move, right? He starts showing his daughter how to throw it, and after a couple of decent throws, he gets a little too confident. He winds up and launches the frisbee with way more force than necessary. The thing hooks hard to the right, and of course heads straight for my daughter. Before I could react, the frisbee smacked her square in the mouth, knocking her right off her feet. I ran over, picked her up, and saw that her lip was busted. There was blood everywhere, which made it look worse than it was, but it was still a shock. A small crowd started to gather, and my daughter, understandably, was crying. JD came strolling over like nothing was wrong, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "She walked into the throw." I looked at him, trying to hold back my frustration, and said, "No, I saw the whole thing. You were throwing it to your older daughter, who was standing 30 feet to the right, and you missed. Why were you throwing that frisbee in the middle of a crowd when you clearly don't have the skill to control it?" JD just stood there, speechless, with nothing to say for himself. That's when a petty idea hit me. I whispered in my daughter's ear, asking her to play along. She was still sniffling, but she nodded. I made a big show of checking her lip, and with a crowd still watching, I said, "It looks like you knocked out her 2 front teeth." JD's face went pale. "Oh no, did I really knock them out?" Right on cue, my daughter, still sobbing, looked up at him with a most pitiful face and said, "Yes." She then opened her mouth and pointed to the gap where her baby teeth had been missing for weeks. She immediately buried her face in my shoulder, pretending to cry, but I could feel her shaking with laughter. She was doing her best to hold it together, and honestly, I was trying not to crack up myself. JD was beside himself, apologizing over and over, but I just patted my daughter's back and walked away. We both knew the truth, those teeth had already fallen out, but JD was none the wiser. Fast forward a few years to middle school graduation, and I ran into JD again. By then, I had pretty much forgotten about the whole frisbee incident. But JD hadn't. He actually brought it up, saying something like, "I still feel bad about that frisbee thing. I hope your daughter's okay." That's when I saw my chance for round 2. I pointed at my daughter, who was now wearing braces, and said, "Oh, you see those braces? Yeah, you knocked out her baby teeth. Her orthodontist said that because the baby teeth weren't there to guide the permanent ones, they came in all crooked." JD's face dropped, and once again, he was speechless. I had completely made up the story on the spot, but the look on his face was priceless. My daughter's teeth are perfectly fine now, and JD? Well, I'm sure he's still the same old know-it-all, but I'll never forget how satisfying it was to see him squirm twice. And honestly, I'm still a little proud of how my daughter played along so perfectly. Even now that she's grown up, she's just as clever and devious as ever. Story 7. A few Thanksgivings ago, my uncle, my mom's brother-in-law, managed to ruin the celebration in a pretty spectacular way. We had extended family over, and some of the adults were playing card games. My mom was doing really well in the game, and out of nowhere, my uncle, who was clearly drunk and possibly high, decided she was cheating. He straight up accused her of it. My mom just laughed it off, but he wasn't having it. Instead of dropping it, he flipped the entire table they were playing on. It sent glasses flying, and the table fell right on top of my mom, pushing her into the corner. For some context, my uncle is a huge guy, around 6'4" and about 230 pounds. My older brother, who's only 5'3" and maybe 140 pounds, saw what happened and immediately charged at my uncle. Other family members jumped in to help, but my uncle was easily the biggest and strongest one there. He started swinging at everyone, really going after them, while they tried to stop him. While all this chaos was happening, I did what I could to keep the younger kids safe. I gathered all my younger siblings, cousins, and nieces, who ranged from toddlers to mid-teens, and barricaded us in a room. The kids were screaming and crying, but I just had them huddle together and tried to calm them down as best as I could. I hushed them and listened closely at the door. Now, the next part I didn't see with my own eyes, but I was told what happened later. Apparently, my uncle beat down my brother pretty badly, and my cousins and dad tried to chase him out of the house. They wrestled down the hallway, and at one point, they slammed into the door I had barricaded. Luckily, they didn't break through. Eventually, they managed to shove my uncle outside and lock the screen door to keep him out. I think they hoped to talk him down or at least keep him from coming back in. The screen door we had was pretty sturdy, made of metal mesh with a metal frame, but my uncle wasn't going to let that stop him. He started slamming on it until the screen broke off in one corner. That's when, apparently, my dad grabbed a machete which was still in its packaging for some reason and chased my uncle off the property. My mom's sister, who's married to the uncle, decided to get in her car and drive around to find him. She left 3 of her kids stranded at our house. Needless to say, the party was over. When things finally calmed down, my mom had some minor scrapes from being shoved over. Our door was broken. My brother's eye was swollen shut, and my dad was furious. Now, this all led to even more drama a few weeks later. My uncle's oldest daughter was having her first child and had planned a baby shower at her parents' home. My cousins are all really close to my mom because she's always been there for them, whether they needed a place to stay or someone to talk to. So, my cousin really wanted my mom to be at her baby shower. The problem was that my uncle had never apologized for what happened on Thanksgiving. To make things worse, my mom's sister, the uncle's wife, had told my mom that no apology was necessary, saying she just needed to get over it. My mom's sister even came over to talk about it with a mysteriously bruised face and implied that her husband's actions were somehow justified because my mom was probably cheating. To be clear, my mom wasn't cheating, she just doesn't drink or use any substances. So beating a bunch of drunk people at cards wasn't exactly difficult. Anyway, my mom refused to go to the baby shower unless my uncle apologized. She gave my cousin 3 options. Either my uncle wouldn't be at the shower, he would apologize, or my mom simply wouldn't go. This upset my cousin to the point that she started talking badly about my mom to other family members. My younger siblings, who didn't know the full extent of what had happened on Thanksgiving since I'd managed to shield them from most of it, were excited to go to the baby shower. After talking it over with my mom, she decided I should take them to the shower without her. My older brother, of course, wanted nothing to do with it. My mom thought maybe our presence would smooth things over, and in a way, she was right. The baby shower itself was pretty uneventful. My uncle stayed in his room the entire time, and when he did briefly show up, we didn't acknowledge him. After that, we left. For the next few months, that side of the family wasn't invited to any of our gatherings, except for a few cousins. Eventually, though, my mom's sister started showing up again, and soon after, my uncle did too. Neither of them ever apologized. They just started showing up less frequently and never stayed long at any family events. It's like the whole thing never happened. And honestly, that's just how my family is. They forgive almost anything. Oh, and the screen door? It's still broken.